indigenous and native communities, we believe that you are made from this Mother Earth, Makaina, and as such, you are spiritually connected and you represent her.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today I'm here with Kevin Martin, who's the founder of the Starlight Foundation. Kevin is a Sioux and an Assiniboine tribal member from the Fort Peck Reservation in Montana. Kevin's the father of the Martin sisters, who are very well-known Navajo entertainers, and he's a traditional counselor at Rock Point High School. He has a master's in school counseling, and he is an accredited multicultural counselor. Thank you so much for being with me today, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
Well, Kevin, as a person who studied a form of medicine that is not indigenous to the region where I live, and I learned about plants that grew on this other continent, but, I learned principles that I really didn't feel I was able to find anywhere in the ecosystem where I was raised. I would say that in my search to learn more about the plants where I live, because, a lot of the medicine that I was taught was plants that grew in India, I really have gotten more curious about what grows near me and what's native to the area. And I start researching it, I come up against I find gardening books, and maybe I'm not really looking to garden. I'm really looking to learn what is native here. And gardening, you could kind of do all kinds of things with. And maybe I'll find some books on foraging. But as I started looking at this, a question came up for me about the body of knowledge of plants and other medicines that were used by the Native Americans who lived here. And I haven't seen a lot. And I also know that maybe don't know the right places to look in as well. But because I want to learn more about the plants where I live, and the books kind of all seem like they're all from Western or European herbal lineages, I'm really curious about to what extent the knowledge within the Native American communities of medicine, different methods, and the use of the local plants and the knowledge of the plants, how much has that been preserved within the communities?
Okay. First, prior to me speaking to that, let me go ahead and introduce myself in Navajo so that any relatives that are listening in Navajo will understand. And I'll explain why. Kevin Martin and Yeshia, Shushchi and Shlo, Canoe Paddler, Bashishchin, Shoots at the Trees Clan, Doshanelli, Cree Meti, Belagunner, Doshache, Manazuma Creek, Danasha, originally from Fort. I'm an enrolled member of the Assiniboine people in Fort Peck, and I also have lineages in Dakota, Bokoni, Blackfeet, Cree, and Meti. So in answering that question, I need to preface that I don't presume to speak for all of Native America. I have lived on 4 different reservations and have had an education wherein I've met over 96 different tribes. So I have a little bit of an understanding of what is there and as far as what I've been told. So what I do know that most of the medicine men in every tribe, they keep the medicine very close. They don't really talk about it too much, and they don't really let that be known as to which medicines and what combinations and how they're picked and how they're rendered and how you use them. All of those things are fairly held very close to the medicine men itself. But for myself, I went out with several different medicine men when I was on my reservation. And they were elders at the time. They were in their 80s, etc. So we used to go out and make medicine for various illnesses. So there is quite a bit left. And I would venture to say that there are those elders that do exist in communities, but and as far as written literature, you're probably not going to find that much. It's handed down through word of mouth, and it's very secretly guarded. So even here on the Navajo reservation, you can go down to the local flea markets when COVID wasn't raging. You can go down and find herbologists, and they have a wide variety of plant medicines, and they're labeled in Navajo. So, when you're with a Navajo, they know what type of medicine is good. Example, things that are good for your hair, things that are good for your chest, a lot of respiratory kinds of things, a lot of things that have to deal with the skin. So they have very specific uses. But I will say that a large amount of knowledge was lost during the boarding school era because children were taken away. Most of the way it used to be was that you were raised with these elders that used to walk you through the forest, and they used to help you identify the plants, and they would help you talk to them and make offerings, and then you harvest those. And then there are certain ways and procedures that you utilize the plant. Some of them are not there. You only use the bark. Some you use the root. Some you use both. Some are to be burnt. Some are for animals. I know of several that are for animals, like when diphtheria was going through and when whooping cough was going through, and then certain diseases for horses were going through for respiratory. There's certain plants that we used to go out and get. And some of them you have to put a bag around the horse's head and burn that plant. And that plant was like a pine. It was really strong. It would make that horse cough. And when that horse inhaled it, it would have that bag over its head. And then after the horse got enough dose of that medicine, it would take it off. A lot of that knowledge is not there anymore. Unfortunately, when I was talking to and training with our elders, they were in their 80s, and that was in 1983. So most of those are gone. But you'll find pockets, and it's usually on different reservations. You have to ask, you have to really be well-intentioned and be a humble person and be genuinely liked by the people of the community in order to gain their trust enough to start talking to the elders about that medicine.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you speaking about this, and I feel so grateful to be having this conversation with you, and I can't wait to find out what I'm going to learn today.
Oh, you bet. Well, hopefully I'm adequate to the task.
Well, you're a keeper of traditions, clearly. And you mentioned to me earlier that most of the elders who even speak the language anymore are gone. And also, you've gone through some training to deliver mental health care services as, trained by the modern practice of counseling methods, right? And I
Right.
was kind of curious if there was some contrast there, like similarities and differences in the way that you were taught, I guess perhaps from the mental health approach from the tradition that you were raised in versus what you were, that you've been certified to carry out in your work today as well.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there are differences. It seems like Western medicine, for the most part, deals with people on individual basis and individual modalities as far as bringing a person around who had some identified mental issues. But when you're talking about Native American modalities, they fill in a lot of gaps. I've identified quite a few, especially with this onset of social emotional learning, dealing with positive self-identity issues. Generally, those are generated by leaving the reservation. And for the most part, a lot of people don't really have that choice. If they want a good education, they need to leave the reservation. And depending on how long they spend there and the types of individuals that they are around and the identities that they assume, when they come back, they're significantly different because they've been dealing with individualism for quite a long time. And for real Native ceremony, it's very, very community oriented and very group oriented. And specifically to clans, especially here on Navajo Reservation, I'm very fortunate that that's still intact. And I'm not saying that other tribes don't have that intact, because they probably do, but in various degrees. So there are quite a few differences in as far as mental health and how you deal with positive relationships and social awareness, developing your self-management. When you're on reservations and when you're dealing with clans, it's not so much personal self-management, it's tribal or customary management that are well known amongst all the members of your clan. There are certain ways of behaving and acting and self-care and strategies of calming, their social humor, lifestyle awarenesses.
I think the point that you made about individualism versus community oriented, it does seem, and this has come up actually with a few of the other people that I've interviewed on the podcast as well, this idea that individualism is not all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really interesting, certainly also from the Ayurvedic medicine perspective, that there's this principle that we have, which is like increases like. And so it's like if you eat something that's spicy, you're going to get, hotter and more dry inside because those are the properties of something that's spicy. Or if you eat something creamy and heavy like ice cream, you're going to be more creamy and heavy inside, and just like that. So obviously, I think it seems like in America, there's a big struggle right now to understand the sort of interrelatedness of everything.
Well, your description of that, there's one thing that I would like to reiterate amongst Native Americans, and that's humor. My relatives would say something on the order of, if you lay down with dogs, you're going to get fleas, right? And so it depends on where you're at. I mean, it depends on how you engage with other cultures and you develop your awareness of Euro-Western culture and, how much historical culture you adopt from non-native sources and how you adjust your cultural presentation, how you recognize your emotional vulnerability and cross-cultural experiences, and, how you basically taken and developed your respect and understanding of cultural beliefs. If that was from the native perspective, that's one way of looking at it. But if you did that within, let's say, a city, you're doing the same thing, but your perspective is completely different.
What are some of the key principles that are inherent in the medicine of your elders?
Well, it depends on if, like for myself, Ihaktawa or Yankton Sioux, and for us, we have large ceremonies. Wawangwa Chipi is Sundance ceremonies, of which I dedicated myself to 7 years. And we vow, and when you're young, like amongst the traditional Dakota, Lakota, Nakoda, and most upper plains relatives, it's a matriarchy. And when young women are developing and coming to age, they're very much guarded. It used to be long ago that the young females used to sleep in the teepee with grandma. And if she was particularly valuable, like chief's daughter, she was put inside of a buffalo robe and laced in there during the night and guarded by all her relatives. So you couldn't even really look at their ankles. That's how it was for males in engaging women. And the reason is because the sacred buffalo calf pipe was brought by a sacred woman. And there was a level of respect that all women deserved and it was due. And that was highly, highly enforced in the elder days, the days of our relatives. So very formulaic. In other words, there are certain ways that you approach. Like even when you're going to be visiting somebody, you'd sing traveling song and you would sing songs approaching the teepee. And you would come in 4 stages. And by the time you got to your last stage, if that family was ready to receive you, they would sing a welcoming song. There are certain things in there. For example, if you're a male, you don't talk to your mother-in-law. If you're female, you don't talk to your father-in-law. You had to ask other people. You had to avoid eye contact. So it's come a long ways from those days to today. So all of those things combine in understanding and having reverence for your own culture and examining the positive points of your tribal community and your personal orientation, depending on the level of cultural interaction, basically defined how well you adhered to known rules and how well you presented yourself as an Ixchewichasha, which is just a common human being, and how humble you are. Your relatives would pick you out from your peers and place you into higher and higher forms of learning. So it was a tribal, I guess, ascendancy, so to speak. And in order to learn specific kinds of medicine, you had to, first of all, have the proper dreams. You had to have the proper medicine man teach you those ways. And some of them are fairly harsh. I mean, amongst the Dakota, they were piercing. You had blood sacrifice. You had flesh sacrifice. It depends on how traditional you were. It is vastly different than today's generation. Let me just put it that way.
In some ways, it sounds highly reverent. I mean, Indian culture, I guess, is pretty reverent too, and some of the Eastern cultures, but more reverence about this idea that the tribes are matriarchal, though they're the males always delivering the medicine in this lineage.
This is the way it usually is, and this is the way it is for Native American church in the Peyote ways. A female spirit was sent with these sacred objects with the express purpose of delivering it to the tribe, especially with the pipe ceremony. It was like that. And it dealt with a female coming in a sacred way, and two gentlemen were out hunting, and they saw a female approaching, and they saw that there was something completely unusual about her. And when they got closer, they saw that when this woman was walking, she would lay down, and when the dust had settled, a buffalo calf would get up. She did that 4 times, and each time she got up, there was 4 sacred colors of the buffalo: the black, the yellow, the red buffalo, and the white buffalo. And the last time that she got up, that she got close enough, and she told them she was a very beautiful woman, and one male had bad thoughts about her. In other words, lustful thoughts about her. And when the other person saw that, he stood his ground and he stood there. And when the cloud lifted from him, it was just bones with snakes crawling through his bones. And this woman told him, I have been sent by the Creator to prepare your people. Go back to your camp and prepare your people. I bring you a great gift. And so he did. He went back to his people, told them what happened, and they got ready for her. And that is how the sacred buffalo calf pipe was brought. The medicine was brought likewise in a sacred manner, and the peyote was brought in a sacred manner. Now you have various versions of it, and various tribes will talk about that. But generally, the way I understand was the people were fighting. There was a war going on amongst the native folks. And she got separated from her relatives during the fight. And she was running, and she was crying, and she was praying. She laid down, and she was out of food. She had no water, and she was basically getting ready to die, but she was still praying. And when she laid there, she heard a voice, eat me, drink me. I am food and I am water. And she looked all around, and she couldn't see anything. And she laid down again and closed her eyes, and she heard the same thing. And so when she looked to the side, she saw that peyote. She looked at it, and it talked to her, and she ate that. And then she immediately came back to life again. It sustained her, and she brought it back to her relatives. And, there's various versions of that, but that's basically how our big medicines have been brought. So I can tell you of those two.
You are a person who facilitates the peyote ceremonies in the Native American church. I think you mentioned that to me earlier. And what is the context in which this ceremony would be done?
This is probably originating formally around the 1890s through 1900s, right? And during that time, there was heavy prosecution of Native Americans in all ceremonies. It was forbidden to do most ceremonies. And so this came up through the southern states. And, there are various different versions of who brought it, et cetera, et cetera. But the only way that it was going to be accepted was to be incorporated into a church, which they did. I think the Oklahoma Territory, predominantly it was brought in the form of a church. And today, let me just go ahead and spin it through because there's just a lot of history there, but bringing up to speed on what it is today, it's national. There are over 250,000 members, the Native American Church, and they have members in Canada, Saskatchewan, Alberta. I know that we set up a division in Pheasant Rump in Canada, they asked us to help them, first of all, get their reservation. So we went up and set a teepee up and we prayed, and they got their own reservation. Then they asked to go ahead and use the medicine. So we did. From the Indian Religious Freedom Act, it basically allowed us to be able to utilize the sacrament throughout the United States and set up and have our altars and legally go ahead and possess our membership cards so we can travel from state to state and not be bothered by any law enforcement. So it is used as a holy sacrament, and it's used in 4 multiple different kinds of things. It's predominantly used to pray for the family. Some kids, they'll have meetings for their education. People are often sick or in some stage of recovery, either recovery in their marriages, recovery for their health, recovery for mental incapacitation. There's just, practically anything that you would pray about in a church, in a formal church, and let's say Christianity, or it's exactly the same thing. It's just different methodology.
And would you say, because obviously, being also part of this modern, quote unquote, mainstream healthcare system, would you say that it's kind of similar to how people are using psychedelics I don't actually know if the experience is a psychedelic experience, but yeah.
Yeah, it's something that I've popped in, especially in Clubhouse, because it's an audio drop-in. I'm listening to mushrooms and I'm listening to ayahuasca, different kinds of things like that. And to be honest with you, most of the vernacular and most of the referencing from a non-native is different than when you talk to tribal members. When you're talking to our people that actually use it, I've only seen like maybe 4 or non-native people in ceremony down here. And I've been down on Navajo Reservation for like 23 years now. So I've not seen a lot of non-natives in there. Outside reservations, yes, I've seen that. And so your approach and your vernacular and how you talk about it is completely different. So I do see that. I do know that, mushrooms and psilocybin is being utilized and it's being formulated similar to Native American ceremonies. And those of us within the Native American community are standing up and saying, we would really like a seat at that table, because cultural appropriation within that realm, I think, is very inappropriate. And most natives, if you're going to basically formulate and model a introduction of another plant, for us, it's a very spiritual modality. And there's history and there's stories and there's ceremonies and there's protocol. And there is just so much that goes along with it. So that when you take just, anybody can go into a ceremony and look at it at its face and motion through some of these things and then take and place, instead of peyote, they're taking mushrooms and putting it in there. That is something that the Native American community is going to actively object. So
I've been surprised how it's been taking off the way it is in the mental health space. And that's why I brought it up, because of your background. I mean, you seem to have like a really interesting background to contemplate that particular thing that's happening in society. And
oh, thank you. I've been approached by several of these groups, especially on Clubhouse, to sit in there and listen, but I don't want that to be misconstrued as actively endorsing what's going on. I listen to see what direction they're taking with the development, the implementation. And, by no measure does that take away from the medical value, because I do understand that an organization like MAPS, they've developed white papers on it. They've gone through quite a few of the hurdles that it takes to get this pushed through, and they're still developing that. I do understand that they've also identified about 250,000 people with post-traumatic stress disorder that it could be utilized with, and over 450 million worldwide. So I do know that it is valuable, but to take a lot of our ceremonial ways and utilizing feathers and crystals and sage and all of these instruments of our ceremonies, and to transport that right back into another entirely different area, I think, would be inappropriate. It's equivalent to having the Pope's regalia and the priest's robes, and then just take all those things and then go ahead and set up something on a beach somewhere and pass them around, and then everybody's dancing and they're having a summer fall festival with the robes Pope's hat on. And I think anybody that would see that from that community with the Christians would highly object to something like that. It's the same. It's equivalent, I think.
I get so excited. I get this kind of goosebump feeling when I get a booking from a new client that I haven't met yet. And I get so excited because I know that somebody has made a decision to go really, really, really deep into their healing. Because I know that Ayurveda is not a quote unquote normal thing that many people have access to, at least not in the United States where I live. So I know that when someone books with me, that they've really made a decision that they want to go deep into their healing. And so you could do that on my website at heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. You can book me for either a Ayurveda consultation if you're ready to dive in, or you can also book me for a 15-minute connection call if you're not sure where to go yet. I do have a couple offerings that are not on my website, and we could talk about that. So I look forward to meeting you. Well, I would say growing up in high school, I was obsessed with going to powwows. We didn't have a lot of them where I grew up. I grew up in Rhode Island, which was, I guess, Narragansett Indian land.
Oh, yeah.
I had this experience of these powwows, and I'm sure I had kind of some pop culture version of what's really available for people in the places that I had exposure to, because not, coming from that background. But I was always interested in Native Americans and, loved art, and just everything just sounded so wonderful to me about it. And I remember going to a Cherokee reservation in North Carolina when I was in college and meeting with the tribal elders. And here I had this very romanticized notion about what life was like as a Native American, because I loved the art and I loved going to powwows. And then I remember meeting with some of the tribal elders and hearing about the rates of depression and substance abuse on the reservation. And here I was really dumbfounded and just so, so, so ignorant. And I always had it in my mind that these people held a better way to live. Mm-hmm. And then I was so crushed when I went to this reservation and I actually saw how difficult of a time everybody was having with the suicide rates and the alcoholism and everything like that. And obviously, as I learned more about the history that led to that. And there's probably so much I don't even know. And I know that you work on the ground in this community. It is your blood. It is your background. You are an incredible contributor to the community and the work that you do. And you're dealing with teens mostly on a day-to-day basis. I know you do a lot of different projects, but one of your big roles is as a counselor to teens, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's why all of what you had said is that we have to basically instruct in cultural competency now, because Native identity, just like any other identity, there are levels. There are traditional people that will not listen to Native American church or Christianity or any other form. They're just completely, strictly traditional. And then there are those at Native American church that'll talk to the traditional people, but they don't necessarily talk to the churches. Then there are those in churches that'll talk to both of the above, the traditional and Native American church. And then there are those that are in the LGBTQ community who have a hard time fitting in all of those levels. And there are those that are basically comfortable in their own skin and identify. And so in other words, I think you understand that we have to develop our family identity. We have to also develop our cultural identity. We have to strengthen our cultural values, recognize personal boundaries, rights, needs, identify healthy and unhealthy family roles, talk about our familiarity and defining what our family expectations are and what our actual practices are, how we understand our cultural identity, how we present our cultural identity. We have to understand our clans. We have to teach them, talk about storytelling and historical preservation, using cultural connections between our emotions and our behavior from a Native perspective, how we understand different cultures, reflect on resiliency and recover from our misunderstandings and our practices, whether it be inherited from dysfunctional members of the family that have been drinking. And, we have to develop honesty in what it looks like. And to that end, we also reteach environmental identity. what our conflicts of land use is about, what our sustainable environment practices, what are our develop our rights and understanding of the existence of all life, and practice our environmental cultural practice, and understand how our clans are tied to the land, how we value the land, and how that juxtaposes with Euro-Western culture and their historical culture, how it's been presented to us through formal education, recognize our emotional vulnerability and cross-cultural experiences. So I think you kind of understand that we really have to retrain through the use of cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive restructuring. And that's why I like dialectic behavioral therapy. It helps us to basically put them into a place of understanding how they can be again, rather than what they have learned elsewhere. And it's highly effective.
Yeah, I'm only a little bit familiar with DBT. Can you talk a little bit about how that works, dialectical behavior therapy?
It's something that, I'm not a trained therapist in DBT, so I really can't go too far into that. I've basically approached it from the standpoint of where I am in the matrix of healthcare services on this Navajo reservation. Because the social services are so sparse, they don't have the personnel. So we end up in the counseling services, we end up doing multiple things. Oftentimes it takes an hour and a half to get police to where your location is. So if a student is suicidal, if a student is cutting, if a student is doing any number of self-harm, we're the sole responders. So oftentimes when they go off into the Indian Health Services, into the mental health division, that's what they utilize. They use dialectical behavioral therapy. And this process of being able to survive within an environment that doesn't necessarily change, it's how you can survive the day. For example, if your mother told you to take out the garbage, or your dad assigned you to do something, and they often fly into fits of rage and they're not above laying hands on you, so you didn't do something. So instead of thinking about it all day long, from the moment you get off that bus, all day in school, it's a way of helping you to live in the moment. You take charge of those hours that you are there from 8 o'clock until 5. You don't need to utilize your whole day worrying. It's a way of bringing yourself back into the moment. It's a way of helping yourself through mindfulness exercises. It's a way of helping you participate if we have student events, and to actually be there and own that moment. And so, like I said, I can't go too deep into it because you have to be certified in order to legitimately use it. But I utilize the understanding of those things and meld those into our tribal traditional ways, because in our school, we're allowed to use our traditional ways. We have hogans. We utilize our instruments to be able to talk to that person and meet them on the needs that they have at the cultural identity level where they live. If a person is, for example, a Native American church, they're familiar with the customary practices. We can utilize cedar, we can utilize song, we can utilize mindfulness and what we call makochiwa. In my language, I say makochiwakan, which is to ground yourself from that central location to the four directions above you and below you, and understand that space that you create can be like a ascending sphere of rainbows outward, and that you basically define that space within your own mind. You reground yourself to your elements, because in Native communities, we believe that you are made from this Mother Earth, Maka'ina, and as such, you are spiritually connected and you represent her, as well as, the Wakiha, all those that swim, all those that make a living underground, those that make a living on the ground, those that make a living in the sky, and those that are above and beyond this earth, in what we call Makasitomani, or Wichakpi is like star people, right? So it's a way of helping you to identify yourself. And it depends on if the student is understanding that, and that certainly is in the traditional aspect. That's a Native American church. And some churches will allow that understanding and blend that with their understanding of Christianity. Some children, although not many, are more in the Asian and Buddhist and Taoism kind of understanding of life. And some students just don't really have an identified spiritual base. So we meet them on every level. So you have to be fairly fluent in your understanding and your perspective.
Yeah, and it feels like all young people, people in general, but especially young people, are probably having a pretty difficult time right now. I mean, just the school shootings that were going on like crazy before the pandemic, it just feels like that particular generation is just having a really rough time. And, adults are having a really rough time too. We know that,
Oh, yeah.
you and I were involved in a discussion about mental health the other day, and, even how a lot of the pharmaceutical companies are pulling out of the mental health space to try to treat certain mental health disorders with pharmaceuticals because they're just not really having a whole lot of luck with it. And it does feel like, at least with mental health, there are a lot of people feel like they're at a loss. And there's listening to you speak, and I feel this way about when I hear, I guess, my Ayurvedic elders. I mean, they're not like people I'm related to, but I have a deep reverence for the elders of that community, as and similar to how I would my grandma. And it just feels like there's this level of depth to the life experience, really dropping into the body and really dropping into the heart and really dropping into our sensory experience of nature. And I'm kind of curious if you're seeing right now, whether it's in this last year or in the last few years, are you seeing an increase in people wanting to learn about, Native American culture, about some of the practices that have been passed down through the generations?
Absolutely. Without a doubt. I hear it all the time on Clubhouse, and I hear it from the students. I see it on TikTok. I see it in different places. And it mostly comes from outside reservation, interestingly enough. Those that are living within the culture, depending on whether or not their parents actually are traditional practitioners. Many are not. A lot of parents drink. There's all different variations of abuse that goes on. And so what happens is a family is raised with tradition. The grandmother, grandfather, the Che and the Masani, the grandmother and the grandfather are very traditional, don't drink, don't do drugs, they don't go to concerts, they don't do a lot of the things that outside of the culture actually engage in. So young children go out and they see these things, they get themselves.
The traditional people don't party, basically. Is that what you're saying?
No, no. Like for myself, I haven't drank in 41 years, something on that order. So it's very aseptic. And there are certain things that if you're going to hold medicine, you just don't do. Those are things that you just don't do. And so when children get themselves involved with that, there's cultural bridges that need to be rebuilt.
What it sounds like is that there's an interest both from people within the community to learn more about the lineage and also from people outside of the community as well.
Yeah. The problem is outside of the communities don't have a sense of our traditional what they call Dojint Ito. You don't do it. You don't go there. You don't cross that border. And I understand other communities out there for a lack of any kind of functional model. They like to take native culture and take and do their own version of cross-cultural practice. But in many, let me put it this way, most of what I see out there is just outright taking it and just seeing it at face value, taking the feathers and sage and crystals. And I see multiple things on YouTube. And for the most part, medicine men look at that and they just laugh, because they have no clue what they're doing. And as far as our traditional ways of approaching it, in as far as their heart and who they are as human beings, they're trying to live a beautiful way. And we respect that. But to basically take some of these things and just really abuse that, that's always going to be opposed. And that's what I see happening, especially on Clubhouse right now with some of the communities there. I mean, people have gone as far as talking about the fact that we as Native Americans don't have a right to call ourselves Native. I've seen it go that far, and very argumentative and very, very much in the way of, I guess, cultural attack, which I don't understand, but it's happened. I've had rooms, I've had discussions where people just really resent natives talking about we are the gatekeepers and we don't share. And so therefore that cancels out gatekeeping and cancels out the sanctity of what we're doing, et cetera, et cetera. So I try not to engage in any of those discussions like at all, because for us traditionally that's just not productive at all. And we see a lot of that.
I think a lot of my colleagues, well, a lot of the elders probably in the Indian Ayurvedic community probably feel very similarly. And also what happened in the yoga communities in the United States. I think there's a lot of similar kinds of appropriations that have been done. And I think it's obviously a challenge that everybody's trying to work through. And when I was in Ayurveda school, actually, the cultural differences were really palpable. And, American people were just messy and informal,
Yes.
and we don't have any reverence as opposed to, somebody in Thailand who walks up the street and lights some incense at the end of the road because there's, a place to do that, or just those reverence points in the culture. We don't have a lot of them. And even when we had our teachers come from India, we actually had in all of our classes essentially not quite like a translator, but somebody who was more familiar with the culture, who essentially prepped the students to be able to receive this person well. And I remember that being just such a huge thing. And so I understand a lot of what you're saying about the lack of knowledge of the rituals, and therefore just it starts taking it in pieces. And thank you for sharing that, by the way, because I do think people need to hear this and learn more about it. So I really appreciate you saying this. And I know that you've started a foundation recently. I think it was recently, the Star Life Foundation, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about that. Could you tell us a little bit about that foundation?
Sure. Star Life basically began from my desire to build a home on the reservation on my wife's land. And it basically took off through the help of Peggy Lou, who her organization, her foundation, JUCCE, JUCCCE. We developed a global nonprofit charity organization through the help of many beautiful people. And it really is a soil to soul understanding of trying to mitigate and help with all 17 of the sustainable developmental goals that have been forwarded and put in place. And it is a foundation, initially we began with very few people, and we received some donations. We received help with the establishment of our foundation, and it was spun up rapidly. Like within 3 months, we had 0 to foundation has been registered in the state of Utah. And so we had multiple people helping Peggy Lou, Todd Porter. We had folks that developed our webpage for us for free. So if you go to Starlife Earth, you'll hit us. You'll also find it at starlife.world. And we have what we do is serve as a hub for 501c in and around the Navajo Reservation. We looked at what was happening during the height of the pandemic and started to understand that the internet capacity on the reservation is just so very poor. About 80% of the communities just don't have it. We're very rural. For our schools, we saw a reduction in students passing our classes. It was all online. Most of the students were not able to get online. So we had a large amount of our students retaining. They were having problems getting water because what wells there are, the water had dropped significantly in those wells. So, these folks are relatively poor. There's about 65% of the population are unemployed. And, during the pandemic, I would venture to say probably, pushing that up to 75 to 80% are not employed. Outside of the reservation boundaries, there were mechanisms in place to basically help those communities immediately. That didn't happen on the Navajo reservation. So Star Life came into function when people were really desperate for food, shelter, clothing, and water. And so we were able to, through our organization, get some donations done so that we can get some broadband in place. We helped and assisted with getting people on board that understood source water was one. Source water were hydro panels that took moisture out of the air and delivered up to, 5 liters per week to Navajo families so they could get water out of the air. Highly expensive, though. So we were engaged with, I have an NDA with the company, but a low orbit satellite company, very well known, been in the news forever. I can't say the name, but just understand that we were in high level discussions with multiple people. And what we really ran into in some cases was jurisdiction, because as a 501c3, getting satellite communications was more in the jurisdiction of the Navajo Nation rather than a 501c3. And some of the folks that we talked to, they had been dealing with large grants, a massive amount of money, up to $500 million. And that's what we were basically told. So we hit a wall on that, but we were able to get food, shelter, and clothing to some folks. And we're still working on our organizational structure. And it's been good. And, we're still working on exploring a lot of those avenues, primarily in community, revitalizing the arts and language and tradition, working on stimulating jobs, sustainable businesses, bringing them. I've got about 8 businesses right now that want to engage with Navajo Nation. And our mission basically is prosperity for Navajo Nation, provide reliable internet, revitalize our culture, stimulate the business, and then provide that as a template to be followed by all 574 other tribes. And so in a nutshell, without going on too much, that's basically how Star Life came up. If you'd like to see it, Fortune Magazine did an article about us. And if you just look under Indigenous Clubhouse and Fortune Magazine, you'll find the article.
Well, Kevin, I really appreciate all the time that you've given today. And thank you for sharing the information about your foundation. I hope that some of the listeners decide to check that out and support. And I know I'm just at the beginning of learning more about this. And I'm so grateful that you gave the time today. And I want to ask you one final question, which is, how would you interpret the term wisdom of the body?
It has a significant meaning because depending on the type of medicine that you utilize, depending on your type of practice, there are levels and depths that go along with understanding. For example, medicine men can see inside your body. Some of them have been inside your body looking. And what we do know is that there's order. We do know that there are sacred colors, sacred patterns, the rhythm of your heartbeat, and the passageways of synaptic connection. A lot of those things have been explored by certain medicine men. And, it depends on the level. Like I said, if you're looking at somebody who deals with plant medicines, they'll understand and be experts in those fields. There are those that work with feathers. There are those that work with water. There are those that work with earth. It depends on the practice. But for the most part, if you go along, and we certainly in the Native communities do not reject any knowledge that will further your ascension to wellness. It doesn't matter the culture, because we understand that the Creator put us on this earth separate and individual, gave us all that was necessary to proceed with life in our prayers and our languages and the colors of our skin. And the diversity of life was heralded by a sacred being and put us on this planet together. And to understand how to proceed in life is to answer that original question of why. Why were we all here together on this planet? And so wisdom of the body is, to me, to understand yourself as a representative of all that you see, all of the elements, all the earth elements, and those in fire, and those in wind, and those in water, and to understand yourself and ground yourself, makochi waka, what we say. So if you understand that you are a part of this world and a part of this life, and seek to take care of the entirety of this earth, because for us, this earth is our body. All the air we breathe, it is us. The wind that blows, but it is our words, it's our breath. We represent those things. So for me, that's a pretty deep question. I'm not entirely sure if I satisfied you with my answer, but to me, it depends on the depth that you want to go into it. If you want to go into exercising, there are plenty of folks out there that'll help you to understand that. But if you want to get into more really in-depth quantum mechanics or quantum manifestation, for example, yeah, you're going to spend a lifetime.
Kevin, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing. I really mean it. I'm so grateful that you took this time to speak with me today. And thank you so much for being on the Wisdom of the Body.
I'd like to thank you once again for inviting me to your podcast. Hopefully, I know we discussed quite a few things, but hopefully for your audience and for yourself and for people that may be interested, if I could serve as a bridge, a cross-cultural bridge, I'd be more than happy to do so. And for my relatives, one of the reasons why I'm stepping out is because there are very few left that have the capacity and understanding and the experience from the baby boomer generation, so to speak, till now. And I look forward to building cultural bridges so that we all can step forward into a better future and come to a better place of understanding for peace, prosperity, and love for all of humanity in this earth. So with that, I like to say Matakiawasi, which means in the name of all of my relatives. So thank you.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on the Wisdom of the Body.